The morgue has a way of silencing everything. Noise, life, even thought if you let it. For me, it's a refuge, a place where emotion is unnecessary and facts are absolute. The living are chaotic, filled with lies and contradictions. The dead, though, they tell the truth. I prefer it that way. I've worked in this hospital for nearly 2 decades. In that time, I've seen every manner of death you can imagine. Violence, neglect, disease. They all leave their signatures, and it's my job to read them. I approach my work the same way I approach everything else, with precision, efficiency, and as little sentiment as possible. It wasn't always this way. There was a time when I cared, deeply, foolishly. That version of me died years ago, the same day my wife did. A routine surgery, something I'd performed countless times before, but the scalpel slipped, just enough to tear the wrong vessel, just enough to flood the room with blood faster than I could stop it. The hospital didn't blame me. They called it an accident. I didn't argue. What was the point? Nothing they said could change the outcome. And so I buried her, along with any part of myself that might have grieved. Now, I keep to myself. I'm not interested in hospital politics or the rumors that pass for entertainment among the staff. The nurses call the morgue the whispering morgue. They say the dead here aren't as quiet as they should be. I've heard their stories. Drawers rattling, voices in the dark. Superstition, the product of exhaustion and too much caffeine. But lately, I've noticed things. It started small. A sound here or there. A faint creak. A distant shuffle. Easily dismissed. This is an old building. Pipes shift. Vents hum. But last night, something changed. I was preparing a body. A middle-aged man, John Doe, brought in after a supposed hit-and-run. His injuries didn't quite match the story. Something I meant to look into further. As I positioned the body on the table, I heard it. A tapping, soft but deliberate. It came from the drawer behind me. I stopped what I was doing and turned, my gloved hand still holding the forceps. The sound continued. 5 taps, then a pause, then 3 more. Rhythmic. Too precise to be random. I opened the drawer. Nothing. Just a body, pale and unmoving, as it should be. I told myself it was the ducts, the building settling. Stop him. I froze. Not out of fear. I don't scare easily. But there was no denying what I'd heard. Those 2 words, spoken clearly and directly, had no place in this room. I spent the rest of the night in silence, methodically completing my work, refusing to look at the drawers for longer than necessary. The rumors about the morgue have always annoyed me. They're distractions, fabrications. But now I'm not so sure. The voice from the drawer haunted me, not in the way most would imagine, but in its persistence. It lingered in my thoughts like a loose thread begging to be pulled. Stop him. The words meant nothing, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that they were directed at me. Still, I continued my work. That's what I do. Observe, document, and explain. It began subtly. During routine examinations, I started hearing faint sounds. At first, it was easy to rationalize. A soft wheeze here, a faint hiss there. Natural processes of decomposing bodies releasing gases. But the more I listened, the harder it became to ignore the patterns. There were pauses and cadences, almost as if the sounds were attempting to form words. During one examination, I distinctly heard what could only be described as a sigh. Long, deliberate, and undeniably human. I didn't pause. Pausing would give the sound more weight than it deserved. Instead, I cataloged the findings, noting the enlarged heart, the signs of arterial blockage, and the absence of any foul play. I moved on. Then came the young man. He was brought in as a result of a high-speed collision, or so the report claimed. The injuries were consistent with a violent impact: fractured ribs, a punctured lung, and a deep laceration across his scalp. But as I began the external examination, something about the wounds struck me as unusual. The laceration was clean, too precise for a head smashing into a windshield. The ribs, though broken, showed signs of being snapped by something uniform, not the chaotic force of a crash. I filed these thoughts away for later. As I prepared to make the first incision, I heard it. "Help us." 2 words, barely above a whisper, spoken from the corpse lying motionless on my table. I froze, my scalpel hovering above the young man's chest. The words were faint, yes, but unmistakable. I stood there for several moments, staring at the body, my mind methodically searching for an explanation. The vocal cords can produce sound post-mortem under certain conditions, but this was different. I looked at his face, pale, slack, lifeless. There was no movement, no sign of life, no logical reason for what I'd heard. "Help us," the voice repeated. I stepped back, glancing around the room as though expecting to find someone else there. Of course, I was alone. The morgue has always been a solitary space, and I've always preferred it that way. But now, the silence felt oppressive. When I resumed the autopsy, I found more anomalies, traces of a foreign chemical in the bloodstream, one I couldn't immediately identify. Surgical scars along his abdomen that hadn't been noted in the hospital records. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. Someone had operated on him recently, and it wasn't in a controlled setting. The next day, a nurse approached me during her rounds. A young woman, nervous and hesitant, as if speaking to me required great effort. "Dr. Merrick," she began, her voice low. I've seen things down there, in the morgue." I didn't respond immediately. I rarely entertain gossip, and she knew it, but something in her tone made me listen. "Figures," she continued, "in the corner of my eye. I've heard things too, whispers, sometimes crying." I remained silent, my expression blank. It was clear she wanted reassurance, a dismissal of her fears, something logical to ground her. "Your shifts are late," I said finally. "Exhaustion plays tricks on the mind." She nodded, though she didn't look convinced. "Of course, doctor." As she walked away, I couldn't help but wonder if exhaustion was playing tricks on mine as well. The body was that of a woman, mid-30s, listed as a sudden cardiac arrest. The report claimed she had collapsed while shopping, rushed to the emergency room, and pronounced dead within the hour. It should have been routine, a straightforward case of heart failure in a seemingly healthy individual. But by now, I had learned to look deeper. I began my external examination, noting the bruising along her wrists and forearms. Faint, but distinct. Defensive wounds, perhaps, or the result of restraint. Her fingernails were clean, trimmed, but her palms showed faint abrasions, as if she had been clawing at something before she died. I recorded it all with detached efficiency, though my mind churned with questions. It was as I was inspecting her neck, a faint indentation, almost imperceptible, just below the jawline, that I heard it, a voice, desperate, raw, and unmistakably human. "Stop the experiments." I froze. This was no faint wheeze or accidental release of gas. This was deliberate, clear, and full of pain. My gloved hands hovered above the body as I looked around the morgue. It was empty, of course. It was always empty. I looked down at the woman's face, her lips motionless, her eyes shut, the muscles slack with death. Stop the experiments. This time, the voice sounded more distant, as though fading. My mind wrestled with the impossibility of it, but I couldn't ignore it any longer. Experiments. I stepped back from the table, pulling off my gloves with a practiced snap. My pulse remained steady. I had trained myself too well for it to betray me, but the word echoed in my mind. The abrasions on her hands, the bruises on her wrists, the peculiar indentation on her neck, they didn't align with cardiac arrest. I turned to the computer in the corner of the room, pulling up her records. Name, Christine Morrow. Age, 34. Admitted through the ER. Cause of death, sudden cardiac arrest. The details were sparse, almost suspiciously so. No attending physician listed. No mention of resuscitation attempts or medical interventions. Just a sterile conclusion devoid of context. Something was wrong. I logged into the hospital's internal database, a system I rarely used outside of verifying a name or department. I searched Christine's name, expecting to find a more detailed history. Appointments, lab results, medications. But what I found instead was a single note: transfer to Department 11. Department 11? The hospital had no Department 11, at least not officially. Curious, I broadened my search parameters, looking for any records linked to this mysterious designation. Dozens of names, each tagged with the same note: transfer to Department 11. No admission records, no discharge summaries, just names and the occasional cause of death. A cold clarity began to form in my mind. The anomalies I'd been noticing, the scars, the chemical traces, the inconsistent injuries, they weren't coincidences. These people weren't patients in the traditional sense. They were subjects. Experiments. I scrolled through the list, my eyes scanning the names with growing unease. Each one was familiar, not because I had treated them in life, but because I had examined them in death. Christine Morrow, John Doe from the car accident, the elderly man with the enlarged heart. Every name led back to the morgue. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I considered my next move. Accessing these files had already put me at risk, but I couldn't stop now. Digging deeper, I found a subfolder marked with a string of encrypted characters. It required an administrative login. I hesitated, knowing that bypassing this would leave a digital trail. But the voice I had heard just moments ago, pushed me forward. Stop the experiments. With deliberate precision, I entered a command to bypass the encryption, something I had learned in my younger, more reckless years. The folder opened, revealing a collection of documents labeled Project Elysium. The files were dense, filled with medical jargon and redacted sections, but the intent was clear. The hospital board had been running unauthorized trials on human subjects. Patients, vagrants, even employees who had disappeared without explanation. The experiments ranged from drug trials to invasive surgeries, all conducted without consent. My eyes settled on a familiar name, Dr. Howard Vance, the hospital's chief medical officer. His signature appeared at the bottom of every document, along with a timestamp. The experiments were ongoing. The realization hit me like a scalpel slicing through flesh. The bodies I had examined, the anomalies I had noticed, the whispers, the voices, the sounds that haunted the morgue. They weren't just figments of my imagination. They were echoes of pain, remnants of lives ended in terror and betrayal. I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair, the cold air of the morgue pressing against my skin. My work had always been about uncovering the truth, but this truth was something else entirely. For the first time in years, I felt the faintest flicker of something I couldn't quite identify. Was it anger, fear, or simply the weight of knowing too much? Either way, there was no going back now. The hospital had always thrived on its atmosphere of hushed efficiency, polished floors, muted voices, and a collective sense of purpose. But now, every shadow felt heavier, every silence too loud. After uncovering the files, I couldn't unsee the truth. This place was a graveyard for secrets. I made the mistake of voicing my concerns the following morning. Dr. Howard Vance wasn't in his office, but I found a senior administrator, Michael Harrington, in the boardroom. Harrington was the kind of man who looked like he belonged in corporate, not healthcare. Sharp suit, calculated smile, and eyes that betrayed nothing. "What is Department 11?" I asked, bypassing pleasantries. He blinked once, then leaned back in his chair. "I'm not sure I understand the question, Dr. Merrick." "You do," I said evenly, placing a printed copy of the files on the table. "These experiments, these people, they pass through the morgue under false pretenses. I've seen the bodies, the scars, the evidence." Harrington's smile didn't waver, but his fingers tapped lightly against the table's edge. "You're mistaken," he said, his tone clipped. "Those records are above your clearance level, and I strongly advise you to destroy whatever you've accessed, for your own good." "And if I don't?" His tapping stopped. He stood, smoothing his jacket, and leaned forward slightly. "You've had a distinguished career, Dr. Merrick. Don't throw it away over misunderstandings." The threat was clear, and I didn't respond. I gathered the files and left, his gaze boring into my back. That night, as I returned to my apartment, I found a note slid under my door. No envelope, no signature, just 3 words scrawled in black ink: "You're next." I held the paper for a long moment before folding it carefully and placing it in my pocket. The threat didn't shake me. It only confirmed that I was on the right path. But then the whispers began. They followed me everywhere now, no longer confined to the morgue. Soft murmurs, just at the edge of hearing, like a conversation I wasn't meant to be part of. Sometimes it was one voice, pleading or accusing. Other times, it sounded like a chorus, overlapping and indistinct. One evening, as I walked down the hospital corridor, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. A shadow darting across the hallway, faster than anyone could run. I turned sharply, but there was nothing there, just the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant beeping of monitors. The bodies were worse. During an autopsy on an elderly woman, her hand twitched. I paused, watching as the fingers curled slightly before falling still again. It wasn't unusual for cadavers to exhibit minor post-mortem movements, nerve reflexes, rigor mortis, but this was different. Her eyelids flickered next, as if she were dreaming. I leaned closer, my scalpel hovering, and for the briefest moment, I could have sworn I heard her heartbeat. I stepped back, staring at the monitors. Nothing. No pulse, no activity, just the stillness of death. But the whispers in the room grew louder, overlapping and frenzied. Another body, a middle-aged man, sat bolt upright during an examination. His mouth opened wide, gasping for air that his lungs could no longer take in. The movement was violent, unnatural, as though pulled by invisible strings. And then he collapsed, lifeless once more. I told no one. I couldn't trust my colleagues, not now. Every glance felt like a potential betrayal. The nurse who confided in me avoided my gaze when we passed in the halls. Even the janitor lingered too long, his eyes darting to my office door before shuffling away. I began staying late, combing through old autopsy records and patient files. I searched for patterns, connections, anything to make sense of what was happening. My desk became a chaos of papers, diagrams, and notes scrawled in black ink. That's when I found the schematic. It was buried in an old construction blueprint of the hospital, dated decades before my time. Beneath the morgue, there was a sublevel, one that didn't appear on any current maps. I found the entrance in a storage closet behind the morgue, concealed by rusted shelving and decades of neglect. The air was thick with the smell of decay as I descended the narrow staircase, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. At the bottom, I found it. The chamber was small and sterile, but its contents were anything but. Rows of grotesque medical equipment lined the walls, machines that buzzed faintly, though they appeared ancient. Glass jars filled with preserved organs sat on shelves, each labeled with a patient ID. My breath caught as I read the names. Christine Morrow, John Doe, the elderly man with the enlarged heart. In the corner, a metal table stood under a harsh light, its surface stained with something dark and long-dried. Restraints hung limply from the sides, their leather cracked and worn. And then, the whispers stopped. For the first time in days, the air was silent. It wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, like the moment before a predator strikes. I turned to leave, but the light above the table flickered once, twice, and then exploded, plunging the chamber into darkness. And that's when I heard it. A voice, clearer than any before, coming from somewhere behind me. "You shouldn't have come here, Dr. Merrick." The silence in the chamber felt alive, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for me to act. I spun around, flashlight trembling slightly in my grip, scanning the darkness. "You shouldn't have come here, Dr. Merrick." The voice was low, almost conversational, yet it carried an edge that set my nerves on edge. It wasn't the disembodied whisper I had grown accustomed to. It was deliberate, directed, and coming from somewhere close. I steadied my breathing, the beam of light slicing across the walls, illuminating grotesque medical equipment and the patient ID jars. The words echoed again, closer this time. "They won't let you leave." I stepped back toward the staircase, but a metallic screech stopped me in my tracks. One of the shelves along the far wall shifted, as if something heavy had slammed into it from behind. My instinct screamed to retreat, but I couldn't leave without understanding the truth. The flashlight's beam landed on the source of the sound, a body, strapped to an upright gurney at the far end of the room. It hadn't been there before. The figure's skin was pallid, translucent in the harsh light, and its chest moved faintly, impossibly, as though trying to draw a breath it no longer needed. I approached cautiously, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. As I drew closer, the figure's head jerked upward, and its eyes snapped open. "Help us," it rasped, the voice jagged and raw, like gravel grinding against steel. Before I could react, its body convulsed violently against the restraints, metal buckles groaning under the strain. Its mouth opened wide, emitting a scream so inhuman it vibrated through my skull. "You will suffer as we did." The restraints gave way with a deafening snap. The body lunged forward, its movements jerky but purposeful, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. I stumbled backward, my flashlight clattering to the floor, casting chaotic shadows across the walls. I reached for the scalpel in my pocket, gripping it tightly as the figure closed in. Its hands clawed at me, skeletal fingers curling with unnatural force. I slashed out instinctively, the blade connecting with decayed flesh, but it barely slowed the thing down. "Stop," I shouted, not knowing if I was commanding it or begging it. "What do you want?" The figure paused, its head tilting unnaturally to one side. Its eyes, clouded, lifeless, seemed to focus on me. "The truth," it hissed. "Make them pay." Before I could respond, another sound filled the chamber. Footsteps, deliberate and heavy, descending the staircase. I turned, still holding the scalpel, as Harrington appeared, flanked by two surgeons I recognized from the operating rooms upstairs. "Dr. Merrick," Harrington said, his voice as calm as ever, though his expression betrayed irritation. "You've been very busy." I stood my ground, the scalpel glinting in the dim light. "This is what you've been hiding," I said, gesturing to the reanimated corpse behind me. "These experiments, these things. You're trying to cheat death, aren't you?" Harrington gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Not just cheat it," he said, stepping closer. "Control it. Imagine a world where organs can be harvested indefinitely, where death is no longer a barrier to medical advancement. That's what we're building here. Progress always comes at a cost. A cost you never intended to pay yourself," I spat. One of the surgeons stepped forward, syringe in hand. "Enough, Dr. Merrick," Harrington said. "You've seen too much. We'll make this quick." Before they could move any closer, the air in the chamber shifted. It wasn't just the temperature. It was as though the space itself had grown heavier, pressing down on all of us. The whispers returned, louder now, forming words that overlapped and clashed, creating a cacophony of anger and despair. The corpse behind me twitched violently, then collapsed to the floor. But it wasn't alone. From the shadows, more figures began to emerge. Men, women, even children, all bearing the marks of the experiments. Their faces were twisted with pain, their forms incomplete, as though they had been pulled from death's grip too soon. Harrington stepped back, his confidence faltering. "They're here for you," I said, the realization sinking in as the figures advanced. "Every life you stole, every experiment you justified, they're here to make you pay." The spirits closed in, their movements fluid yet unnatural. Harrington shouted orders, but his voice was drowned out by the growing roar of the dead. One of the surgeons dropped his syringe and bolted for the staircase, but he didn't make it far. A spectral hand reached out, pulling him into the shadows. His scream was cut short. Harrington turned to me, his composure shattered. "You can stop this," he pleaded. "You're a doctor. Do something." I shook my head. "You brought this on yourself." The spirits surged forward, engulfing Harrington and the remaining surgeon. Their screams echoed in the chamber, mingling with the voices of the dead. The air swirled violently, forming a vortex of shadows and light that consumed everything in its path. I stood motionless, watching as the conspirators were pulled into the darkness, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the room fell silent. The spirits were gone. The equipment lay in ruins. The jars, the bodies, the grotesque remnants of the experiments, all of it had vanished, leaving behind only the faint hum of the hospital above. I climbed the staircase, my steps steady despite the weight of what I had witnessed. There was no one left to stop me, no one left to threaten or silence me. But as I reached the top, I paused, looking back at the darkness below. For the first time, I felt the cold grip of uncertainty. The truth was out, but at what cost? The hospital would survive. It always did. But the echoes of what had been done here would linger, and so would I. I walked out of that chamber, out of that morgue, but the echoes stayed with me. The hospital above felt quieter than it should, as though something unseen had swept through and hollowed it out. Every face I passed, nurses, orderlies, even the remaining doctors, seemed to avoid meeting my eyes, as if they knew or sensed that something had changed. By the time I reached my office, I knew what I had to do. I spent the next several hours compiling everything. Photos of the hidden chamber, notes on the anomalies in the bodies, names I'd found in the files. It wasn't enough. The evidence I had gathered seemed thin in the light of day, less damning than it had felt in the depths of that room. But I submitted it anyway. The board convened a week later. They dismissed my findings outright. Fabrications, they called them. Baseless accusations born of exhaustion and stress. When I pressed harder, demanding they at least investigate, I was met with veiled threats. Dr. Merrick, you've had an exemplary career here. Let's not tarnish that with unsubstantiated claims. The next day, the chamber beneath the morgue was gone. The staircase sealed, the room erased from the blueprints. The files I had copied from the hospital server had vanished from my hard drive, replaced by corrupted fragments. It was as though the events of that night had never happened. I resigned a week later, not out of fear, not out of anger, but because I couldn't ignore the whispers. They started as faint murmurs in the back of my mind, easy to dismiss as exhaustion or the residual noise of memory. But they grew louder, more distinct. In the quiet of my apartment, in the stillness of the night, I heard them. A chorus of voices, pleading, accusing, mourning, and then there was hers. At first, I thought it was a cruel trick of my imagination, a coping mechanism dredging up her voice in my weakest moments. But it wasn't. It was too clear, too deliberate. "Adrian," she said, the same way she had said my name 1,000 times before. But this wasn't a memory. This was something else. I tried to drown it out with music, with television, with alcohol. Nothing worked. Her voice cut through it all. "Adrian," she would whisper, softer some nights, louder on others. It always ended the same way. "Join me." I told myself it wasn't real, that the morgue had broken something in me, cracked a foundation I hadn't realized was already weakened. I told myself I needed to move forward, to rebuild, to find purpose again. But I couldn't. A month after I left the hospital, I found myself standing outside its doors again. The night was quiet, the air heavy. My hand trembled slightly as I pushed through the main entrance. The corridors were just as I remembered them. Sterile, fluorescent, devoid of warmth. I walked them slowly, deliberately, letting the whispers guide me. When I reached the morgue, I hesitated. The door was ajar, though I knew it should have been locked. Inside, the air was cold, biting. The metal drawers gleamed under the faint overhead light, just as they always had, but the room felt occupied. I stood there, for what felt like an eternity, staring at the drawer that had held the first body I'd heard speak. My feet moved on their own, carrying me closer, until I was standing in front of it. I pulled it open. It was empty, and yet, as I stepped back, I heard her. "Adrian." The voice was unmistakable. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was clear, resonant, coming from the very air around me. "Join me," she said again, and this time there was no mistaking the plea in her tone. I turned slowly, my heart pounding, the cold air pressing against my skin. The room was empty, but the shadows felt heavier, more purposeful. And then I saw it. A shape moved in the corner of my vision, subtle, almost imperceptible. It wasn't a person, not exactly, but something darker, something more. It shifted as though it were part of the shadows themselves, moving closer without ever seeming to move at all. I wanted to run, to leave, to fight the pull of her voice. But my feet stayed rooted, the air around me thickening, making it hard to breathe. The last thing I heard before everything went black was her voice, soft and familiar, yet tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "Adrian, it's time." When they found me the next morning, I was slumped over one of the morgue tables, unconscious but alive. At least, that's what they said. But every time I catch my reflection, every time I see the faintest flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, I wonder, was I the one who left that morgue? Or did something else take my place? I still hear her voice at night, And now, sometimes, I answer,